creates questions the human mind cannot answer. Out of reach, past all we can see, hear, and touch, beyond all we understand, lies the extraordinary.
It's a story or an eeriness that gives you some feeling of great bond with our early pioneers, which makes it quite special.
The extraordinary is one man's rescue of the survivors of a plane crash. No one knew where the wreck was.
It was then that I cooed very loudly. I was answered by a cooey within 200 yards of it.
Those who lived through the impact thought they had no chance of discovery. But they didn't count on a remarkable man named Bernard O'Reilly.
It was a tangled mess, of course. It's incredible that anybody got out of it alive.
It is this ordinary chair in a market in the ancient town of Ashdod, Israel. A miracle chair. 250 infertile women sat in it, and 250 women became pregnant.
Miracles do happen, and the biggest difference between knowing that they're happening or not knowing that they're happening is our own perception.
It is a story so bizarre that if pictures didn't exist, no one would believe it.
The chances of it actually happening, if one set out to do it, it's 1 in a million.
A plane landing on a plane. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The extraordinary is the day world champion swimmer Shelley Taylor-Smith found herself swimming alongside a man named Matthew Webb in a marathon race in Italy.
It's not uncommon to have a competitor next to you, but the uncommon thing about it, which really took me back, was like this person was doing breaststroke, and I was kind of like, well, why are they doing breaststroke and why are they keeping up with me?
Matthew Webb could not have been there. He died more than 110 years ago. Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
More from Shelley Taylor-Smith a little later. Good evening, I'm Warwick Moss. Crocodile Dundee is known around the world as the archetypal Australian. Bold, brave, possessed of the skills needed to survive in a harsh environment. Croc was typical of the kind of settler that tamed the vast continent. While he's not real, Croc had his genesis in the scores of real-life McDundees who helped build Australia over its first 200 years. One of those real characters was Bernard O'Reilly, a man responsible for one of the most remarkable rescue missions ever staged. Bernard O'Reilly was an unlikely and unassuming hero. He was from pure pioneer stock, from a clan that carved a paradise out of the rugged yet majestic McPherson Ranges in southern Queensland. Young Bernard was a bush poet and a philosopher who loved classical music. And as his daughter Relma recalls, his personal niche in paradise was a place called Green Mountain, a place he dreamt could be conserved in all its beauty for future generations.
Because he was a man who'd spent most of his time in the bush. He was quite at home in it. And the rainforest was his country. He knew it intimately, and he always knew where he was. He had a sort of built-in compass. You could never lose him. If he'd been to a place, he could always find it again.
While Bernard O'Reilly and his family were taming the wild rainforests of southern Queensland, up above, the early aviators of Australia were taming the unpredictable skies. And at the forefront was the Stinson, an American aircraft capable of an incredible 170 miles an hour that had captured the imagination of this vast continent. The Stinson, operated by Airlines of Australia, had opened a whole new world to travellers and a brand new air corridor between two of Australia's major cities, Brisbane and Sydney.
It was a very fast plane for its day, and so it caused quite a bit of excitement in the world of flying, I think, at that time.
On February the 19th, 1937, the Stinson VHU-HH, the pride of the Airlines of Australia fleet, took off from Archerfield Aerodrome in Brisbane, bound, as usual, for Sydney. On board were a crew of 2 and 5 passengers. The flight was routine, the route up to the pilot. One option was inland, over the McPherson Ranges. The other was straight down the coast. But as there was no radio contact in those days, there was no record of the flight path. As it turned out, the Stinson would never make it to Sydney and would become the focus of one of the great mysteries and one of the great rescues of Australian aviation history. All the aviation authorities were convinced the Stinson had gone down close to Sydney, and they tailored their search accordingly. After all, they had what seemed conclusive proof. 64 reports that it had been sighted near its final destination, one of them from a policeman.
I'd heard some plane, but it wasn't the Stinson, but this did confuse the rescue efforts. And the search mainly was carried out around the Hawkesbury area just north of Sydney. They combed that very, very thoroughly.
5 days after the Stinson disappeared, the official search near Sydney was called off. But more than 600 kilometres to the north, deep in the McPherson Ranges, one man decided all was not lost. That man was Bernard O'Reilly. Something had told him the Stinson was somewhere in the ranges, somewhere in 500 square kilometres of impenetrable rainforest. Bernard O'Reilly, the young bush poet, had only 2 things to go on. Neighbours who thought they'd heard the Stinson overhead, and his unerring knowledge of his beloved Green Mountain. So, while the experts down south were giving up, he was drawing up his plan. And 9 days after the Stinson disappeared, Bernard set out in wet, windy, dismal conditions. He had a few meagre rations with him, and his horse, called appropriately the Great Unknown.
There wasn't any track there after the first 4 miles, so we had to just go blind straight through the scrub. It was raining most of the time and heavy cloud, he couldn't see a thing. He eventually reached a high peak and he just waited patiently until the mist cleared away and he had a view across the ranges. Then he saw one light brown spot.
A tiny speck of brown in a vast sea of green. That was the only clue Bernard O'Reilly had after hours tramping through the dark, damp bush. Here, in an actual recording from 1937, Bernard himself recounts what happened next.
At 8 o'clock next morning, I climbed a very high ridge, about 4,000 feet, and in the far distance, on a very green range, I saw a yellowish patch, which I concluded was some tree that had been killed by, whose leaves had been killed by fire. Knowing that the only possibility of fire would be, well, petrol or something like that, I decided to push forward to this point.
From the direction of the dead tree he'd seen came faintly through the mist a cooee. He said it gave him quite a shock. He thought perhaps survivors had a wrecked plane over there. But he didn't answer because he thought it was just somebody else out searching, couldn't possibly be survivors.
I pushed forward across the gorge. It took me somewhere about 3 hours in a general direction, and it was then that I cooed very loudly. I was answered by a cooey within 200 yards of it.
Just a breath away, but in some of Australia's most inaccessible, uncharted bushland. Yet Bernard O'Reilly pressed on.
At last I found where a top had been cut off a tree, and immediately afterwards I saw the mass of the wrecked plane lying in front of me. However, I got down to them. They were apparently in a fairly bad way. I mean, you can imagine it yourself. People without food, without any hope for over 10 days.
It was a tangled mess, of course. It was incredible that anybody got out of it alive. But 4 others had been killed in it, and the 2 survivors were lying on the steep hillside just below the plane, one with a broken leg, and they looked very near to death. He thought as he looked at them that he'd come too late to save them.
The 2 survivors were passengers John Proud and Joseph Binstead. As Bernard O'Reilly gave them tea and what was left of his rations, he learned that a 3rd survivor, James Westray, had set out from the crash site a week before, determined to find help. Proud and Binstead, near death themselves, had seen nothing, heard nothing of him since he departed on his desperate mission of mercy.
In the gathering darkness, he went as fast as he could. He just ran straight down the hillside into the gorge below where the creek was. It's then a matter of following the creek down. He knew Westray had gone ahead of him within a week before, and he kept expecting to find him, and eventually there was Westray. He'd fallen and he'd broken his ankle and a wrist, quite a few ribs, head injuries. He was really a mess, and this on top of concussion and severe burns from the plane. He'd gone a mile down the creek after that, crawling down the waterfalls. Incredible man. Eventually, Daddy found him just sitting on a rock where he'd sat bathing his broken ankle in the water, and he'd been dead more than a week. Daddy just ran flat out down the creek, and he covered in 3 hours the distance down to the first help. It took the rescue party 8 hours to get back up there, because he had come, as he said, hell-driven, just with the fear that they'd be dead before he got back.
But Bernard O'Reilly did get back, this time with a search party. They'd had to hack their way through the tangled bush, cutting their own paths for the stretchers and the survivors. Almost 4 full days after he drew up his plan, after he set out in search of the Stinson, Bernard O'Reilly had achieved what seemed absolutely impossible.
He'd lost nearly about 16 kilos in weight. He'd left home Saturday morning, and it was Tuesday afternoon by the time they'd finished the rescue. He'd lost that weight in that time, and many of the rescue party would have been in pretty much the same condition.
The 2 survivors that day must have considered themselves the luckiest men on earth. Both went on to have successful careers in business. John Proud was eventually knighted for his services to the mining industry. And Bernard O'Reilly, the reluctant hero, went back to his lasting love, the beautiful country around Green Mountain, where his descendants live to this day, determined to carry on his dream. The wrecked aircraft still lies rusting in the McPherson Ranges. It's now 57 years since Bernard O'Reilly braved that inhospitable country to solve the mystery of the Stinson. But as international sportsman and commentator Chris Handy found out not long ago, some things about that crash remain unexplained.
It's a story or an eeriness that gives you some feeling of great bond with our early pioneers, which makes it quite special.
Remarkable achievement in finding the Stinson stunned Australia, but it was not the end of the saga. Almost 60 years on, strange things continue to happen at that crash site, deep in the bush. The spirit of one of the dead, James Westray, seems to linger in the rainforest and makes its presence felt by those who visit his grave. In the McPherson Ranges of the 1930s, the Stinson rescue made history. A story that more than 50 years later still excites those with an adventurous streak. There was the injured James Westray's valiant but fruitless trek through the rainforest for help. And of course Bernard O'Reilly's superhuman feat that saved 2 lives. A feat still remembered by his descendants, including great-nephew Shane.
I think Bernard said on a number of occasions too, he wouldn't have been able to find, he doesn't think, without some divine intervention. And for those that do the walk and know the walk, they normally can agree with that and say, yes, it's a really tough walk, and how we ever found it, they've no idea. People still get lost today, even though there's a track.
The Stinson story has long fascinated Chris Handy, a Brisbane publican, sports commentator and former international rugby representative. Not all that long ago, he transformed that fascination into action. In homage to Bernard O'Reilly and James Westray, he and about a dozen mates set out to retrace the 36-kilometre journey through the rainforest to the site of the wreck. It was to take 12 hours through some of the roughest terrain in Australia, made easier only by the experience of Shane O'Reilly, who was the party's guide. It was an exhausting, arduous journey, and the ultimate destination was the grave of the hero, James Westray.
Lot just said, bugger the grave, you know, we don't want to see it, you know, that type of thing. And I thought, well, look, I'm never going to be back this way again. And if I were to get to the end of it and somebody said the greatest part about it was the grave, did you see it? And I didn't, I don't know what I would have done.
And when we got to Westray's grave, Chris just lay down in the grave, put his head back and said, no disrespect, Mr. Westray, I think you're the bravest man around. He said, but I just got to lie in your grave. I think I'm going to die.
I was aware of this eeriness when each of the fellows arrived. They've sort of gone, oh, you know, you can't lie on somebody's grave. And I just, because of my, I suppose, exhaustion, wasn't quite aware of what I'd done lying down on somebody's grave.
The grave of James Westray, the man who died trying to save his 2 companions from the Stinson. As Chris Handy collapsed onto the shrine marking Westray's final resting place, it was just before 3 p.m. An hour Chris Handy will never be able to forget.
I suppose the most extraordinary part happened later on. We noticed just down the track that his watch had stopped and just before 3 o'clock, if I remember rightly, and that was about the time that he lay in the grave. And it didn't worry us too much. We were all fairly tired, but I think Chris was a bit spooked at the time.
But not as spooked, not as mystified as he was after he tried to have his treasured watch repaired.
Since that time, which has now been, you know, some 3 or 4 months, the watch has not gone. Not only that, I've taken it to my jeweller, who says it's not just that it's a new batteries required, it's just that the watch will never work again.
An expensive watch that inexplicably stopped at the very moment Chris collapsed into James Westray's grave. Just an accident, or some kind of message. Chris Handy is a practical man, but he's not sure. One thing, though, is certain. He'll always wear this everlasting reminder of past heroes and heroism.
Simply to wear it is, I suppose, in a little way, paying tribute to Westray, whose grave I had probably been a little bit disrespectful at, but even mindful of that, it just reminds me particularly of a place in time that I set a goal and achieved it, and I'm mindful of all those people that do heroic and you know, pioneering type things.
Is a chair that sits in a supermarket in the town of Ashdod in Israel. It's a normal supermarket where Orthodox Jews buy their bread, fruit and drinks and go home to cook and raise their children. But for the women who shop there, especially those who have no children, there is something special about Victor Wagner's supermarket. Something that requires extra orders for the baby food shelves.
It is happening in the most ancient land, the most historic site of man's spirituality, a place where the mystical and miraculous have moved the world toward faith and religion for thousands of centuries. In Israel, where the biblical reference of half the world's population is founded in stone and parable. And yet, it is all about something as simple and commonplace as this chair. It sits by the back wall of a tiny market crammed with Kellogg's cornflakes, handy wrap and baby food. The market is on a side street in the old city of Ashdod. Every morning before it opens, a line of women forms outside its unremarkable front door, and each of the women has something in common. They want to be pregnant, and they are not. The chances are, within 3 months of coming to the little grocery store of Victor Wagner, despite years of trying every known method of medicine and ritual, these women will finally become pregnant.
We are a world that's witnessed many miracles. It's only a question of us opening our eyes to the miracles that go on around us.
For 2 years now, the secret of the miracle of Ashdod has been slowly spreading across Israel and the world. Up to 200 women a day come to read a prayer and sit on this simple chair.
I've been here for about 2 hours. Now it's just a matter of a few more minutes. 5 minutes.
Are you excited?
Yes.
The story of Ashdod's miracle began one day in 1992 when a rabbi, Yitzhak Kaduri, a Moroccan-born authority on Jewish mysticism, sat on the chair during the opening ceremony to bless the market. The shop's first 4 cashiers had each been trying to get pregnant. One of them had given up hope after 12 years of failed fertility treatments.
As time passed, the owners and operators at the stores started to see that their clerks started to ask for maternity leave. It was very, very strange. They weren't very surprised to see a whole slew of them suddenly leave on maternity leave. And they hired a whole new staff, and then their new staff was gone within 6 to 9 months on maternity leave again. So they started to realize something mysterious is going on in the store, where every person that comes to work there suddenly becomes pregnant.
In Israel, a woman's success or failure in childbearing is a matter of great interest to the local community, partly because it is central to the Jewish faith and partly because of Israel's vulnerable size and population in the Mideast. So the pregnancies were noticed by many, though not explained. It was only when store owner Rabbi Victor Wagner began to ask questions that he found one common link to each of the women.
We investigated this and saw that this was a phenomenon from the chair. Everybody who sat on the chair who worked as a cashier got pregnant.
Since that day, literally hundreds upon hundreds of childless women have sat for 10 minutes on the Ashdod chair and become pregnant immediately after. The woman sitting on the chair today is named Hannah, the daughter of a woman named Simcha. She wants to have a son. Hannah is told to drop 3 coins into the charity box and say out loud that the charity is for the good of the Jewish people. As the local rabbi's wife recites a prayer, a woman from Bnei Brak is preparing to take her place on the chair.
It's my turn to go in.
She places a red cord around her waist to bless herself and reads the blessing.
With God's help, she'll be pregnant in a month.
The rabbi's wife has become a voluntary helper at the Miracle of Ashdod. She has no idea why the chair works. but says that in Ashdod alone, 140 babies have been born to childless women who sat on the chair. Rabbi Victor says he is still amazed.
What kind of chair is it? It's a regular chair. At first, it was sitting by the cashier's counter, but it was in their way, so later we put it in a place where it was not visible.
The women who flock to the small market are not all religious, but they don't argue with success, and Vagnin's book of success stories keeps them coming. He does not charge a fee for the sittings, but insists all the women follow orthodox teachings and say prayers before they can use the chair.
How did you hear about the chair? My sister gave me the phone number and the address. I called and came.
Did you meet any women who got pregnant?
No, but I have heard about them. I've heard about lots of miracles.
Are you religious?
No, but I still am here. I do believe in this. Every Jew has a belief in his heart.
The rabbi's wife arranges the covers. They're a gift from a woman who got pregnant after 7 years and a visit to the chair.
I write down the names of the women as they are waiting in line. I tell them to say the prayer and to drop 3 coins into the charity box, saying that the charity is given for the sake of the Jewish people. Then I tell them to sit in the chair while saying the prayer. Whoever is a believer succeeds. Anyone who does not believe...
Miracles do happen, and the biggest difference between knowing that they're happening or not knowing that they're happening is our own perception.
I feel this is a real blessing for the Jewish people. One woman told me that I was the grandmother of 140 babies in Ashdod. Thank God, 140 babies were born. This is a miracle.
Whenever the human body and mind are taken to the limit and beyond, they enter the world of the unknown. Reactions are not predictable. Responses cannot be relied upon. The mind is no longer rational. World champion marathon swimmer Shelley Taylor-Smith has gone beyond the limit many times and knows what is real and what is not. That's why she was taken aback when she found herself swimming in a marathon championship in Italy in 1993 alongside a man called Matthew Webb. Matthew Webb was the first man ever to swim the English Channel. Trouble was, he died in 1883. Dover to Calais in 1875. It was unthinkable. It was madness. They said no one could swim the English Channel. But a young seafarer and adventurer called Captain Matthew Webb proved the doubters wrong and made a small fortune in the process. More than a century later, that hero would mysteriously reappear. Maybe even save the life of another marathon swimmer, the Australian champion Shelley Taylor-Smith. The exploits of Captain Webb, no doubt, have influenced the career of this superwoman. Like him, she found the lure of the English Channel irresistible.
You go over there and you have all these expectations for how you think you can conquer the English Channel, and you get there and you just go, wow, it's nothing like I anticipated. You know, it was a personal achievement, and I realised I was one of the select few when I became the 409th attempt of the English Channel, and only just over 100 to be successful. I really believe that my ability to be so successful is my mental approach. I have the edge there, definitely.
That edge, that strength of mind, have helped Shelley dominate women's marathon swimming to remain #1 in the world for the last 6 years. Time after time, race after race, year after year, she's demolished all opposition, shattered all world records. But it's just possible Shelley Taylor-Smith would not be around to bask in this fame if it hadn't been for the intervention of Captain Matthew Webb, the first person to swim the English Channel.
It was a big year in 1990 when I swam the English Channel. I won 9 races, 3 world records, and went on and won the World Championship in Perth.
1990 may have been one of Shelley Taylor-Smith's great years, but 1993 was one of the most gruelling and, without doubt, the most mysterious. She was in Italy, preparing for one of the 13 marathons she'd contest that year, a 5-hour race across the Mediterranean.
We got there that week and it was beautiful and sunny and warm and flat, and we came out on race day to torrential downpour. The seas were just huge. We were swimming against the current, so we knew we were going to be we were going to have a long day at work.
This home video will give you some idea of just how bad the weather was, how long that day at work would be.
We were just ready to go, and thunder and lightning just struck on the ocean, and I looked to the Americans, the Yanks, and I said, "Do you race in this?" They went, "No," and I went, "Neither do I," and then the gun went and off we went.
Shelley Taylor-Smith had to call on all her strength, all her power to keep going. Yet again, she would take herself to the edge and then some.
I felt like we were never going to get there, and it was just so emotional because I had already swum 7 marathons in the last 10 weeks prior to that swim, and I was physically and mentally exhausted by about the 5th hour.
Come on, let's go, just up there, move it!
Shelley's coach, Graham Carroll, had seen his champion battle the elements before. He knew she was at peak fitness. He knew she had incredible stamina. But this day, this race, was going to test her endurance to the limit.
There was thunder and lightning around us, and the fog came down, and it was like we were flying. You know, you look out the window and you're in the clouds, you just can't see anything. And Shelley was out there, and I could hear her swimming.
We were into the race, and I remember exactly because I couldn't find my coach Graham, and I couldn't actually see anybody around me, and the next minute I had this sensation of someone next to me.
All alone, yet not quite alone. In the middle of a turbulent Mediterranean Sea, Shelley Taylor-Smith had this overpowering feeling that another swimmer was pacing her, guiding her, protecting her. One thing is certain, that swimmer was not another competitor. He was not wearing a cap or goggles, but he was matching her stroke for stroke. Except, and this amazed her, she was swimming freestyle, he was doing the breaststroke.
And then the next minute I'm looking up, looking for people, other people around me, and this voice kind of came to me saying, it's okay, you're going to be safe, you know, because I was literally petrified, like every other swimmer was terrified of swimming in lightning and not knowing where we were going. And this voice just kind of reaching out to me saying, you're safe, I'm here to guide you, you know, you're going to be okay. And kind of a peace came over me.
At peace in the midst of a tempest. And Shelley wasn't the only one who felt another presence. Her coach, Graham Carroll, also sensed someone else was out there in the eye of that storm.
I thought I could hear 2 people swimming rather than just one person swimming out there. And I thought, oh, that can't be, that's pretty stupid. But after a while, you know, I could still hear these strokes, and it wasn't her stroke, it was another stroke.
I thought I'd really lost the plot, and it wasn't cold, so I knew it wasn't, you know, the hypothermia setting or anything. And I remember just looking, and this face just seemed so familiar.
So familiar, so eerily familiar. It was the face of Captain Matthew Webb, the first man to swim the English Channel way back in 1875. It seems incredible that somehow an English adventurer from the 19th century could have been there in the Mediterranean in 1993, a source of solace and strength for the Australian champion. Incredible, but a fact, according to Shelley Taylor-Smith.
I take in a lot when I'm swimming, so actually seeing him was just so clear as day. Swimming along and all those terrifying climatic conditions happening around me, the thunder and the lightning and the downpour of rain and the fog, and having that voice come across to me, it just kind of made my heart rate just lower, and I just felt just a sense of comfort come over me.
With or without Matthew Webb's help, Shelley Taylor-Smith went on to win that 7.5-hour race and to continue her dominance of international marathon swimming, more than 100 years after Webb's death. You see, the captain perished attempting another world first, to swim the whirlpool rapids below Niagara Falls. In his quest for more fame, more fortune, Matthew Webb drowned on the 24th of July, 1883. There are many things in this world that are hard to believe. We hear and see things that defy reality and explanation. If it sometimes weren't for photographic evidence, many things that did happen would be discounted as figments of the imagination. This story is about not one, but 3 unbelievable happenings, all caught on film. This is the photograph you were never meant to see. A near tragedy that should have been one of the best kept secrets of World War II.
The chances of it actually happening, if one set out to do it, it's 1 in a million.
It's only thanks to Dennis Rind that we can tell you what happened, because the military brass in Britain did everything they could to suppress the story. Late in 1943, Dennis was a photographer with the Royal Air Force, stationed at the Kinloss base in Scotland. He remembers the night in question vividly, even though it was more than 50 years ago. An Armstrong Whitworth Whitley bomber was preparing for a cross-country exercise. The pilot was taxiing for takeoff. Everything seemed in order.
He lined himself up on the runway to start his takeoff and presumably got the go-ahead to take off, usually by a green Aldous lamp. Anyway, he got the okay and started to trundle down the main runway.
In the distance, another aircraft, an Anson, was on its way back from a training flight, descending toward the Kinloss base.
He slowly made his descent, presuming that it was all right to land, and he lined himself up on the runway.
The same runway the Whitley bomber was using for takeoff.
He would be directly above the Whitley, and their speed slowly matched. The Whitley would be increasing its speed, of course, and the Anson would be decreasing its speed, and they just got closer and closer together. The Anson crew had no idea that there was another aircraft below them, and similarly the Whitley had no idea there was an Anson directly above them. And they met at speed, probably both about 80 to 60 mile an hour, because the Anson had not touched down yet, and they came together precisely one on top of the other. It couldn't have been neater if you'd actually load one on top of the other by crane, and they just locked there.
There was a terrible noise as the 2 aircraft, still locked together, careered down the runway. At first, the Anson crew thought they'd crash-landed, that the undercarriage of their aircraft had collapsed. They were about to discover that the reality of the situation was even more remarkable.
Although they knew they'd come to a standstill, they had no idea that they were on top of another aircraft. They couldn't see it. All they had to go on, really, was the fact that their airspeed was nil, their engines were shut off, vibration had ceased, they were down. And for all intents and purposes, they had made a landing, however untidy. And the radio operator who sits near the rear of the Anson, he just opened the door and stepped out as usual, of course. The Anson doorway is normally about 3 feet off the ground. And he must have been very surprised because he would have had about a drop of 10 feet.
And drop the radio operator did, landing in a crumpled heap on the runway. He suffered a broken ankle, and that, miraculously, was the only injury sustained in the incident, a potential disaster. Even today, Dennis Rind can't believe how close the Whitley and the Anson came to crashing.
They came together relatively gently. The Anson straddled the Whitley, and you know, its weight was supported, so there was no hint of any crushing. There was no collapse of the aircraft. The aircraft were later able to be taken apart and repaired and flew again.
Dennis Rind called that a 1 in a million chance, but it's remarkable what you find if you take the time to flick through the aviation files. This photograph dates back to the 7th of December 1943, the same year as the incident in Scotland. 2 Canadian Ansons, yes, Ansons, locked together in mid-air on a training flight and landed safely like this, piggyback fashion. Both were repaired and flew on for the Canadian Air Force until the end of the war. 2 amazing moments from the annals of aviation, in Scotland and in Canada. But wait for it, there's a third. This one in Australia on September the 29th, 1940. This time, 2 aircraft, again 2 Ansons, collided in mid-air. Somehow, they too locked together. The pilot and observer on board the lower aircraft parachuted to safety. But the pilot of the top Anson, leading aircraftsman Fuller, stayed at the controls. He was able to steer both the planes into a bumpy but successful landing. Pilot Fuller escaped with minor injuries and was hailed a hero, especially since his miraculous double landing saved the Australian government something like £40,000. There was, however, an ultimate irony. I.G. Fuller was killed later in the war when his bike collided with a bus.
Times of stress and hardship often give rise to loss of faith. But a family in Melbourne says they will never give up hope again.
When I saw the image had returned, I was astounded. Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
A damaged heirloom restored to mint condition. A miracle that no one can explain. An untold story. Next time.
That remarkable story next time. Also next time, the sea rescue that should not have happened. The seas were fierce, the storms savage, and no one was looking for the man that was rescued. A tale of tragedy and stunning luck. For now, good night. See you in the future.
This tragedy is the worst ocean racing tragedy that Australia's ever encountered.